Thank you very much. You're right about the long articles, sometimes also long lectures. You all may have had the experience that in rewriting, you don't necessarily shorten what you're writing. And I've been rewriting this quite a bit, and it's a long paper, so certain sections of it I will summarize, but I hope it works to keep the theme. Keep you aware of the theme. The texts, the topic, America and the end of civilization, God and the disenchantment of culture, is the title. I want to focus my reflection around two sentences from Gaudium et Spes 36 on the justa rerum terrenarum autonomia, so the rightful autonomy of the worldly things, the things of the world, and one is creatura sine creatore evanescet, which means the creature without the creator disappears or would disappear. And the second is per oblivionem Dei ipsa creatura obscuratur, that when God is forgotten, the creature itself is obscured or becomes unintelligible. So I want to reflect give a reading of those terms, of those two assertions, and in terms of a disenchantment, and which will also involve me in giving a reading of disenchantment. I'll get into that. So the term disenchantment, as many will recognize, I take the term disenchantment from early 20th century German sociologist of religion Max Weber in his well-known claim regarding religion and the development of economic culture in Anglo-America, that the logic implicit in Calvinist Protestantism, Protestant or Puritan theology, led to die Entzauberung der Welt, the elimination of magic from the world or the disenchantment of the world. A century earlier, a German philosopher and poet Friedrich Schiller had used the phrase die Entgilderung der Natur, which is the elimination of God from nature. So in this lecture, I want to propose a reading of these phrases in light of the work of Weber, but also then in light of Gaudium et Spes, especially paragraph 36 of the text I cited. The title refers to America and the end of civilization, and by this is meant the finality or purpose of human civilization. The finality or purpose of human civilization. Discussion of end in the sense of finality, however, implies coming to terms also with those ways of being and acting that undermine realization of this finality and so far lead to the ending of civilization. So let me begin with a couple of central terms here. The first is Hans Urs von Balthasar, in his book on Reinhold Schneider, says that the man who follows Christ to the full can never, ever be a bourgeois. He is not himself as the bourgeois is. He is the image of another. He defends the form, but never the boundary or limit, like the bourgeois. So the bourgeois is just himself. He's one who follows, the one who follows him, Christ is, to be sure, himself, but at the same time only as the image of another. These words, by which Balthasar identifies the basic difference between a bourgeois and a true follower of Christ, indicate what seems to me key in distinguishing a false autonomy, false kind of autonomy, one that renders creatures unintelligible, from a justa autonomia, the legitimate autonomy that discloses the authentic meaning of the creature in himself as at once transparent to the Creator, refers back to the Creator, or enables us to hear the voice of God in the creature. A second term that I will use is symbolical, and which is in a certain way synonymous with the meaning of bourgeois. This symbolic, and I should say, I take the term symbolical here. I stole it from my son's most recent, just completed manuscript called, of his next book, which is Freedom from Reality, John Locke and the Diabolical Character of Modern Liberty. But I would count this as an instance of honest theft, okay? Symbolic. So what the etymology, very briefly, this is very rich. Symbolo in the Greek means literally to throw or to come together, and hence also to join or unify. Symbolon originally meant a tessera, the tessera hospitalis, token of hospitality, the half of an object, for example, a bone or a die, that a host would break in two and hand over to the safekeeping of his guest while retaining the other himself. The term is also used in connection with the Nicene Creed, the symbol of faith, of the unity that binds us together. So I want to give, I will define this, unfold this a bit in relation to my, as I unfold Trausch, but there's also a text that's helpful in getting into the ontological meaning of this. Ratzinger says that there will be no cure if God is not recognized as the structural core of our whole existence. Only in togetherness with God, being with God, does human life become real life. Without him, it remains below its threshold. It destroys itself. We cannot construct this togetherness. So there are two key elements there. And the first is that if we're outside, we're being alone and not being with God, we don't simply maintain our integrity. We slip below the threshold of what we are. And secondly, he singles out what does this is construction, the act of the creature being first construction. And so that's really, in a certain sense, I mean, just to identify very briefly the issue, the metaphysical issue here. What I want to argue is that being in itself is the image of another. That is symbolical of, another way of putting that is being is symbolic of God's power as love, which is to say it unfolds into a true image of God. Whereas being that is itself, so just being abstracted from that relation to God, unfolds into something less than itself. It unfolds into a counterfeit image of God. And in fact, this counterfeit image as counterfeit begins to disclose a diabolical logic. That is the heart of my argument. Now, what the point of my paper is, so another way to put it is the key is that is to understand the person in terms of a positive relation which involves a sense of God as positively transcendent versus a sense of oneself that begins through abstracting from God such that God becomes in the first instance, negatively transcendent of the person. And the result is it changes the structure of being, not just neutrality, but it changes the structure of being. It delivers a counterfeit sense of being and acting. Okay. So the main thing then that I want to do is unfold the heart of my talk is to unfold the meaning of that. And that will, going through Weber and so on. And then as time allows here, I'd like to, at the end, depending on time, address a couple of things. One is the meaning of the pontificate of John Paul II relative to this argument, this question of disenchantment, and what I'm going to talk about as the argument is sort of that the question of modernity, of what's emerged in the modern period versus the ancient period, has to do precisely with this imaging of God, positive imaging of God or negative imaging, and the negative not being neutral but counterfeit. Okay, and just as an example, many of you here have read Pinker's. I mean, just to get a sense of what I'm talking about, if we, when Pinker is this argument regarding freedom, and he says the key, if we talk about freedom as indifferent, if we look at freedom, we can look at freedom as kind of an indifferent act whereby the good and God are objects of choice, or we can look at freedom as an act that from the beginning is already ordered by those. Well, the point is that original indifference, the freedom of indifference, changes the nature of freedom. So it becomes immediately an act of arbitrary power, whereas the other view of freedom involves understanding of freedom as love. That's sort of what I'm talking about. So that abstraction from relation leads to that kind of non-neutrality. Okay. And that'll be the heart of my argument. Then I want to show then that the pontificate, this argument I take, I mean, obviously it draws a lot already from John Paul II, but I see John Paul, another way to put this is the primacy of a symbolic reading of reality, which is a sacramental reading of reality. And I then, as time allows, I want to focus John Paul II and the development in his pontificate, and it seems to me this issue, speaking from the point of view of ontology, really, this issue is expressed in two ways, particularly the authentic theology of integral human liberation and in theology of the body. And I want to say something about that, and then if there's still time, or I can take it up in the question period, I would like to comment on sort of the status questionis of issues surrounding the debate surrounding the work of the Synod over the last couple of years. And what does all this imply in terms of the state of the question, the framing of the terms? There's been no apostolic exhortation, so that's not my point. It's the question of how are the questions being framed, and I hope some of this will shed some light on that. And if I don't get into it, maybe that can be raised in the question period. Okay. Okay. So let me get started here with Weber. And many of you are familiar with Weber's argument. In Luther, Weber says, so how disenchantment functions in his argument regarding the spirit of capitalism. Okay. In Luther, Weber says, we find a profound shift in Christians regarding the nature and significance of one's beruf, worldly calling. Luther rejected the idea of a division between two calls of holiness or states of life. One, the life of the evangelical vows, concilia, and withdrawal from the world in order to embrace the heavenly activity of contemplative prayer, monasticism, for example, considered a perfect way of life. The other, the life of marriage and living the commandments, preempta, while remaining in the world, considered less perfect. Eliminating the first state, the so-called state of perfection, Luther emphasized the importance of worldly activity, the everyday work of the world. It was in the world and not in any presumptuous flight from the world that God and holiness of life were to be found. Calvin, for his part, agreed with this new conception of the worldly calling, but also transformed it by virtue of his own distinctive theology. Key was his idea of sin and predestination. Only a small proportion of human beings were chosen for eternal grace and salvation. The rest of humanity was destined for damnation. God's will in the matter of the human being's ultimate destiny was inscrutable. To assume, quote, to assume that human merit or guilt play a part in determining this destiny would be to think of God's absolutely free decrees, which have been settled from eternity, as subject to change by human influence, an impossible contradiction. The Father in heaven of the New Testament, so human in understanding, who rejoices over the repentance of a sinner, is gone. His place has been taken by a transcendental being beyond the reach of human understanding, who God's place has been taken by a transcendental being beyond the reach of human understanding, who, with his quite incomprehensible decrees, has decided the fate of every individual and regulated the tiniest details of the cosmos from eternity. God's grace is, since his decrees cannot change, as impossible for those to whom he has granted it to lose as it is unattainable for those to whom he has denied it. The consequence of this vision, according to Weber, is an unprecedented inner loneliness of the single individual. Each person has to follow his own path as it regards salvation alone. No one could help him. No priest, no sacraments, no church. The sacraments, for example, are not a means of grace, but only the subjective externa subsidia, external helps of faith, while the external church included the damned. Likewise, even no God could help because Christ had died only for the elect, for whose benefit God had decreed his martyrdom from eternity. Weber concludes, this, the complete elimination of salvation through the church and the sacraments, which was in Lutheranism by no means developed to its final conclusions, was what formed the absolutely decisive difference from Catholicism. That great historic process in the development of religions, the elimination of magic from the world, Entzauberung, which had begun with the old Hebrew prophets and in conjunction with Hellenistic scientific thought, had repudiated all magical means to salvation as superstition and sin, came here to its logical conclusion. Now, I'm not interested in getting into the controversies with him. You know, he doesn't say Puritanism caused capitalism. It's sort of a galvanizing force that articulates it, as he rather sarcastically put it on more than one occasion, that the impulse to acquisition and pursuit of gain did not begin with 17th century Puritans. But it's still a kind of watershed moment. And so what's the key? He says the key is rationalizing. So it's the rationalizing process. The acquisition through calculation of capital consisting in money. This rationalizing of economic life is essentially dependent on the calculability of the most important technical forces. This means that fundamentally that it is dependent on the peculiarities of modern science, especially the natural sciences based on mathematics and exact and rational experiment. Okay, although he says the influence goes both ways, that the development of science was influenced by the economic application driven by capitalism. And another criticism is that Weber focuses on the that there are differences among Calvinists, notably, I mean, with Calvin himself and slightly later people, relative to the question of the pursuit of profit and the acquisition of wealth is detrimental to spiritual life. But the key point, according to Weber, is that the real moral objection in Calvinism is to relaxation in the security of wealth, the enjoyment of wealth with the consequence of idleness and the temptations of the flesh, above all, temptations from the pursuit of a righteous life. In fact, it is only because possession involves this danger of relaxation that it is objectionable at all. For the saints, everlasting rest is in the next world. It is crucially important to be clear regarding Weber's methodology. Employing what he termed an ideal, so in his explanation of this, to clarify his point here, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail on ideal type, but it's for our purposes, it's simply the logic or ethos of all this that he's interested in. So, and he said, what is the logic or ethos of Calvinist theology that could be seen reasonably to account for the development of rationalized capitalism among Calvinists in 17th, post-17th century and so on, England and America? This meant that the issue for him was not, in the first instance, the piety or lack thereof among these Puritans, though, of course, for the latter it was tied to a definite piety, but how this logic continued to operate even as it took a more secular or secularistic form. That's why there's no inconsistency whatever in the fact that Weber selected Benjamin Franklin as a salient example of the logic of capitalism, despite Franklin's not living it particularly faithfully. So, some of the other features then, without discussing them in detail, so what elements of the ethos, the utilitarian character of ethics, the importance of the certitudo saluto, to get certainty that you're saved, intense worldly activity as the means of self-confidence in salvation, the rejection of the idea of mystical union with God because the absolutely transcendent nature of God made impossible his penetration into the human soul. Finitum non est capax infiniti. The finite has no capacity for the infinite. The God of, and here is a key point, the God of Calvinism demanded of his believers not single good works, but a life of good works combined into a unified system. There was no place for the very human Catholic cycle of sin, repentance, atonement, and so forth through sacramental confession. And so the world was thoroughly rationalized and dominated entirely by the aim to add to the glory of God on earth. And the world was an instrument to be rationalized for this purpose. So, and then he points to Descartes, and then Robert Merton, historian of science, later in the 1930s, talks a lot about Bacon, Francis Bacon, and so forth. And so his point, here's the point, and in the end of Puritan asceticism was to be able to lead an alert, intelligent life, the most urgent task, the destruction of spontaneous, impulsive enjoyment. The most important means was to bring order into conduct. Not leisure and enjoyment, but only activity serves to increase the glory of God according to the definite manifestations of his will. Inactive contemplation is useless. Now, what's important to see, and is not, I mean, the historical discussions around capitalism, but it's very clear, and he's very explicit, that the disenchanting or rationalizing process Weber describes here doesn't only affect the order of the economy. That misses the point. On the contrary, well, it's important, yes. On the contrary, it affects the whole of human life in the world. It results in the increasing bureaucratization of civil administration, government, in the formalizing of rules and regulations which now become mechanistic functions as distinct from matters of the charismatic activity of human subjects. Furthermore, as mentioned, this rationalization presupposes, even as it increases the demand for the exact measurements of the science, it has become matter primarily of power and control. So you have the whole of life, all major institutions of society are governed by this rationalization. And he excuse me. And Weber himself was negative in terms of where this would lead. He said the last stage of this cultural development, the last stage of this cultural development, it might well be truly said, specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart, this nullity imagines that has attained a level of civilization never before achieved. So he makes a negative judgment. Okay, now let's reflect on that a little bit. The key elements involved in the disenchantment of the world are the utter transcendence and inscrutability of God, the lack of his presence or immanence in the world and in man, the loss of the integrity of worldly and human nature, the isolation and the isolation of the individual, all of this bound up with the deep sense of sin and predestination, and the loss of the sacramental principle of the mediation of divine life to man. So these elements are the key elements, according to Weber, that account for and foster the elimination of magic from the world, the rationalizing of the world. But they also lead to a God-centered existence in the lives of human beings, a certain kind of God-centered existence, a God-centeredness that embraces the entire scope of their lives. But note the paradoxical character of this God-centeredness. Centeredness in God takes the form of preoccupation with his absence, with his negative presence, so to speak. God is not effectively present in man and the cosmos in a generous manner. Through his rationalizing worldly activity, man indeed becomes a sign of God's arbitrary favor, but never an intrinsic participant in that favor, in God's goodness. Rather, man remains always a worldly human subject to whom God's goodness is imputed entirely from outside, and indeed not to all human beings, but only to an arbitrarily chosen few. Similarly, the things of the world that the human subject rationalizes never transcend their status as pure instruments. They remain essentially dumb and apt through and through for use. They can be said to become good only qua subject to the external controlling forceful activity of human agents and thus as instruments, and their goodness also remains something so far imputed to them. So to get a quick contrast, this is not news, but to contrast that quickly, I mean, so what's denied relative to a more Catholic sacramental vision of the world? The consequences, if you compare it to a proper reading of a pre-modern or Catholic vision of reality, we would say, first of all, that worldly being, human and non-human, is no longer understood to be gift, familiar language, in its original givenness as created by God. Worldly being ceases to be in itself an intrinsic bearer of the generosity of God, and thereby ceases to participate in that generosity as a sign thereof. Being ceases to be in itself true and good qua being. Thus, through instrumentalized rationalization, this loss through instrumentalized rationalization of the original giveness of things as gift obtains in the orders of both nature and grace, of the world and the church. Nature no longer indicates the objective presence of God's creative love in the world, and sacrament no longer bears the objective presence of God in Christ's redeeming love in the church. The objectivity of both nature and sacrament becomes like that of a mechanical instrument that as such bears no sign of a generous, loving presence that is inherent and that thus participates in affecting what it signifies. So, according to this Catholic understanding, then, nature is pre-sacramental, signaling the objective, generous, creative presence of God in the world. Things in their very existence and form imply reference to the generous intelligence of the Creator, and the Church is sacramental in the proper sense. In the inmost reality of her sacrament, she signifies while affecting the objective, generous, real, redeeming presence of God in Jesus Christ. So nature and church then may be each said to bear on this Catholic reading a sort of infallible character as signs of God's love. Infallible, objective signs of God's love that communicate that love, of course, in infinitely different ways. Nature is never wholly corrupted and never wholly unintelligible or evil, and Christ is never essentially absent from the church by virtue of his incarnate presence as promised for all time. So I'm going to call this those two, the sacramental principle for shorthand, which includes both nature and sacrament in the proper sense, for the reasons given here. A final point that I should make here is that this changes the root meaning also of objectivity and subjectivity. Objectivity in its root sense is what is it's objectively given as good. And there's something as symbolic, it affects what that of which it is an inherent sign. Objectivity implies, on the other hand, objectivity implies basically a dumb presence that is apt for constructive action on the part of subjectivity. So subjectivity then gets redefined insofar as objectivity is drained of its reality, its symbolic reality. Subjectivity also gets drained of its subjective reality. It simply becomes a constructive action on its own. Okay, now, I want then with this to move, the point here then so far is to make clear that this draining, this shift, and I have to go back and account more, reflect a bit more on what's embedded in this, but the shift from a symbolical to a non-symbolical understanding of being already changes the world, okay? It changes the nature of being and acting on the part of creatures. So it's not mere neutrality, to go back to what I said in the beginning. So what is it? Well, what I want to propose is this neutrality, by definition, is a kind of indifference which then logically unfolds into a counterfeit image of God. And so to spell that out, I want to take the etymological opposite of symbolic, which is to say the diabolical. So the symbolical and the diabolical. So as symbolical is bringing together, dia means through or across, and it's likely that the root is from duo in the Greek, which means two or twice. So dia, or dia, when used in compound words, means in different directions or asunder, and diabolo means to throw over, across, or set at variance. And so in its more extended meaning, it includes slander, misrepresent, deceive by false account. So what I want to do then is reflect on that term in its ontological meaning. The diabolical recognizes the original difference between self and God, and between the self as created in himself and as created in the image of God. But coincident with this recognition of difference, the diabolus rejects the radical dependence implied in this difference, subsuming his reality as image into his own reality, into what he is in himself. The result is he becomes a counterfeit image of God. And here, then, is the heart of the diabolical in an ontological sense. It presents itself as the real thing. It subsumes the reality and power of God, while at the same time falsifying the nature of that reality and that power. The identity of the diabolical is defined by its negativity, which becomes, if you will, a paradoxical identity. It assumes the identity of God precisely by acting or appearing godlike, all the while this godlikeness parodies genuine godlikeness. It appears godlike, but deceptively. It appropriates God's power, but now in a transformed shape. The difference consists in a power that assumes into itself control over what is originally objectively given, subsuming the original meaning of power as love into power as precipitous subjective control, and thereby subverting the human being's constitutive God-centeredness, a logic of true God-centeredness, into what is now logically the subject or self-centeredness. In a word, the diabolical subsumes what is originally objectively given in and as love into itself as origin of love, and in the process creates an appearance of love that destroys the latter's proper meaning, the nature of God's worldly power as love that is gratuitous. First and always given to the world for its own sake, thereby constituting the world and every being in the world, above all the human being, as inherently good. Now, I want to go back with that to Weber and to look again at Weber, because it's so easy. We read Weber and it just seems so quaint. I mean, nobody holds this anymore. And, nobody, well, first of all, believe in sin to that extent, right? Nobody holds this. And Weber's response is, well, that wasn't his point in the first place. Okay, that's what we need to clarify. It wasn't a matter of religious piety. It was a matter of the logic of being and what was the inner logic that led to that. So on the one hand, Weber makes it abundantly clear that this double affirmation of an absolutely transcendent God in a world under the power of sin are inspired by the vigorous religious piety of the Puritans. At the same time, and on the other hand, he stresses that this piety leads to and supports a definite worldly logic or ethos that continues to exist even without grounding in or taking explicit inspiration from this religious piety. The point then is that this logic in any case continues to bear, however unwittingly, a definite conception of God and of the ultimate worth of things, of what is ultimately good or evil. It implies a conception of God as negatively transcendent of the world, of a God who in his infinite distance is effectively absent from the world. So it implies, in short, a logic of God that can harmonize, for example, with both pious religiosity, like in the Puritans, and with explicit or implicit atheism. So the key is the assumption of God as negatively transcendent, whether expressly out of religious motives or none at all, implies not neutrality, but rather an apparent deceptive neutrality that hides a definite sense of man and the world, a man and the world's imaging of God in terms of power now become mechanical power. Such an assumption yields a world, human and non-human, that has begun to assume the counterfeit godlikeness properly termed a diabolical image. So what I'm proposing, the argument there is that at the heart of what Weber is calling this process of rationalization or disenchantment, even though it's motivated religiously, the key, there's an ontological assumption operative in it regarding the negative transcendence of God. That's the core logic. And it's that negative transcendence, that logic, which appears to be neutral, begins to unfold in a way that images God's power as love becomes power as control and things connected with that. And that is what constitutes rationalizing and leads to all of those patterns that he talked about. So those patterns, and what seemed to me, for the most part, what he was identifying, what the Calvinists embraced there, the conception, those patterns of culture, it seems to me are largely still with us and largely do define modernity. So you see the inner logic. The key is not religious motivation, even though it in fact had that origin. Okay. Okay. So that is the key. The key to the argument, I mean, the ontological argument, is being is itself, or being in itself is refers to another, is in the image of another. Being in itself appears, if we start with that, being in itself, it appears to be simply a neutral starting point, but the neutral starting point, in fact, the thing is drained. Its neutrality is, it's just there. It's dumb stuff. It's got no goodness in itself, no truth in itself. That is, it's inherently apt for being instrumentalized. And that's the point. And so the instrumentalizing activity is the instrumentalizing activity then is, it's non-neutral, but what it consists in is precisely now imaging God in a counterfeit way. In effect, I become the first agent of goodness and so on in the cosmos, but in the process, being an agent is transformed. It's a matter of my power rather than my receiving something and being given something. So that's the substance of the argument. Now, how much time do we have? Huh? We still have time. Okay. Then what I want to do then is, maybe we will get to this, the final part then. The key then, I just want to say a word then in that light about John Paul II and what he calls structures of sin. It seems to me that the John Paul II and structures of sin is a fundamental response. I mean, what's striking about that, and so what he calls authentic theology of integral human liberation first, and then theology of the body, he talks about the worldly structures. What's interesting is he talks about worldly structures, institutions, in terms of sin. That's very strange. Now that is what has been going on here, but it is a structure of sin, and what a structure of sin is for John Paul II, it's a personal sin which gets consolidated and takes a structural form. That is to say, it has a logic, and and so the interesting thing is in his liberation theology is that he's dealing with institutions in this radical context of what I would say is a sacramental context, operating according to the sacramental principle, which is that it's affirming the radical primacy of God in the orders of creation and in redemption. And then secondly, the symbolic character of being as a symbol. Fundamentally, what I am is a symbol of God. And then thirdly, the response then, the problems in the institutions according to John Paul II then are looked at in terms of the absence of God's primacy. That's sort of the structure of the problem. In other words, he is asserting, John Paul II, in what he calls a structure of sin, is recovering a sense of God's a positive relation to God, which involves a view of God as positively transcendent, and transforming the structures of the world that have their structures as rooted most basically in a sense of God as negatively transcendent. That's sort of the heart of the matter. Now, and when he, the point here is for John Paul II it's the resistance to John Paul II on that. I mean, I think that his notion of structural sin, there was a lot of opposition on both sides, his point is not. It doesn't deny all the intermediate causes of the disorder, all the technical aspects. Those are real problems. But what he's getting at is that even those technical aspects have to be put in the context, finally, of a symbolic or a non-symbolical, either in the context of a primacy of God or positively understood as a generously effective in the cosmos, or in the context of things understood as in a way that implies a negative transcendence of God. And so what does that mean concretely? I mean, it would take, there's much here to go through in terms of the various institutions. But so if we take the economy, but again, and it's the same, I mean, we saw this in Weber. It's all the institutions were affected. And for John Paul II and his understanding of liberation theology, the key is to see that there's technical expertise that's required, but in each case it's a matter of transforming a false sense of worldly power and a false sense of self-centeredness with a God-centeredness and the power of love. That's the heart of the matter. So if we So when the economy, for example, we think in terms of the economy, in terms of the, if you say the liberal market of capitalism, free market, a certain negative view of freedom prevails, conceptions of poverty, poverty as in terms of what people have or do not have, food and possessions, you have hunger, and the point is, what about the conception of that? The polity, you have a conception of rights, first as negative, they're negatively conceived. Immunity, it's a question of power. And then with respect to science and the academy, knowledge is conceived first as a matter of power. So you have, in all of those cases, you have an expression of this logic that I set out before. It's got nothing to do explicitly. There's got to be some sin in the personal sin in the background, but it's got nothing to do intrinsically as a logic with just Puritanism. It has to do with negative transcendence of God, and then the inverting of that, and then that translating into a false conception of God. So what that means concretely is that for John Paul II, things like hunger has to be understood, food and needing food and so forth. Hunger needs to be understood as hunger for God's love. Poverty is first poverty in terms of relations to God and family and friends, and so forth. Rights are tied intrinsically to my goodness is made for God and for others in God. Knowledge is a matter of power only as a matter first of seeing things in their intrinsic truth, and so forth. All that implies a primacy of the theoretical in the right sense. Primacy of the theoretical, that is, seeing things for what they are in their own sake, as gifts, as given by God. So the point then is, it seems to me, the novelty of what John Paul II, his social teaching, the novelty is his clear awareness of the sacramental principle, his clear awareness of the symbolic meaning of the human being in the ways I've indicated. That the point in each case is a transformation from false power to the power of love, and since the problem at root is a problem regarding the symbolic meaning of the human being, that is to say, a logic of sin. The problem is a logic of sin. Well, what's then the primary response? The primary response, well, it can't be confession, although that's essential. But corporations don't confess, and so on. Structures don't confess. But what is the way to respond? It's through Mary. That is, the Marian fiat and the Marian Magnificat become the key to a transforming logic. A transforming of power, letting things be in a generous way, recovering them in their integrity, and amplifying and deepening their integrity. And that is sort of operative as a way of embracing the entire culture. Okay, so that, but again, the key is negative transcendence of God versus positive transcendence, symbolic view of the human being versus what is originally neutral and then indifferent in a negative way that turns into a counterfeit and therefore follows a diabolical logic. And that is, it seems to me, that you can read then what the Pope is talking about in structures with respect to his integral theology. His authentic theology of integral human liberation is precisely that. Seeing that the fundamental issue is the imaging of God, symbolical or ultimately diabolical. That is, under the power of God as love or not under the power of God, under the power of sin. That's the point. Okay, and there's a kind of interesting paradox that emerges when you look at it then in terms of the different responses to the world. John Paul II then, relative to this earlier argument, John Paul II insists that the world is and always remains in its basic nature good, a sign of the presence of the generous God. At the same time, he recognizes the deep wounding of this goodness through sin. Being and acting in the world, therefore, mean affirming its basic and final goodness while ever transforming it through incorporation into Mary's liberating fiat and magnificat. Modernity, these modern institutions, on the contrary, affirm the real world to be the world as it is, under the influence of instrumentalizing rationalism. The key is in all of those things I talked about is in the end there's operative and instrumentalizing. And taking this world to be, if not good in itself, the best we can do. The problem is that it's governed by a hidden logic of sin, a counterfeit image of the good. And so we could say that insofar as, so this is an argument in each of those institutions. For example, if we talk about the economy, the response is, well, that's the real world. Or politics, we're going to order politics in terms of self-interest. That's the real world. Well, it's the real world if you assume a negative transcendence of God, which John Paul II doesn't. So the diabolical, you might say, insofar as that position prevails, has become successful in the world as a counterfeit image of the divine power, as love. So it becomes what's effectively love. We don't seek to love, we render self-interest mutual and call it love. That would be a continuation of a diabolical logic on this view, with qualified sense I'm talking about. Okay, the second point is the theology of the body, and where it's somewhat obvious, I suppose, but the basic point is all this talk about gift and being as gift, and what I've said about the symbolic logic and so forth, for John Paul II, and it seems to me it's his arguably his unique contribution to the church, not only now but forever, is his recognition that it isn't as though, well, there are all these instances. Every creature is a gift, right? According to an adequate notion of creation. But for John Paul II, in that context, if you start out with that, then the question of the child and the question of the man and woman and so on, and their inherent spousal relationship and their fruitfulness and so on, if you start with those, they become simply examples of being as gift. So let's engage the problems, one of which is the problem of that emerges with respect to original solitude, and then original unity, and then fruitfulness. But those are examples of the problem. It seems to me that's not the developed church's teaching. Now that's an arguable point. Let's just say it. I mean, we could talk about when does it become magisterial, but the point is, for John Paul II, that's not true. What's true is that, in fact, the order of creation, giftedness, the high point of giftedness, occurs in original solitude, which then immediately is original unity. And the relation to the world, what happens to the world, then there are extensions of that. That's the way God's creative love, that's the way God, in the natural order, in the world, communicates his sacramental presence, if you will, in the natural order, pre-sacramental, if you want to call it that, symbolic presence. Now, so what if I, the two paragraphs that I want to quote here that are they're ignored. As far as I know, they've been ignored in the discussion, but these are paragraphs 26 and 27 in the Compendium for the Social Doctrine of the Church. It's very interesting, the logic here. Paragraph 26, okay, it says, the reflection of the prophets and that found in wisdom literature and coming to the formulation of the principle that all things were created by God touch on the first manifestation and the source itself of God's plan for the whole of humanity. And then a couple of lines later, it says, man and woman, created in his image and likeness, are called to be the visible sign and the effective instrument of divine gratuitousness in the garden, where God has placed them as cultivators and custodians of the goods of creation. Okay, now paragraph 27 is what's he saying here about the place of that? 27, I'll read the whole thing here. It is in the free action of God, the Creator, that we find the very meaning of creation, even if it has been distorted by the experience of sin. In fact, the narrative of the first sin, now listen to this, the narrative of the first sin, original sin. Okay, so every time we sin, we're recapitulating it. Okay, and what is it? The narrative of the first sin describes the permanent temptation and the disordered situation in which humanity comes to find itself after the fall of its progenitors. Disobedience to God means hiding from his loving countenance and seeking to control one's life and action in the world. Breaking the relation of communion with God causes a rupture in the internal unity of the person, the human person, in the relations of communion between man and woman, and of the harmonious relations between mankind and other creatures. It is in this original estrangement that are to be sought the deepest roots of all the evils that afflict social relations between people, of all the situations in economic and political life that attack the dignity of the person, that assail justice and solidarity. That is a strong statement. So what's the point? The point is that original unity and original solitude reveal something unique about being as gift. It's not that this is a general thing, and here is an example. It's rather the case, here's the archetype of which everything else is there's an implication for everything else, but it's mediated through that relationship above all, original solitude, original unity. So you have the child refuses to be a child. That immediately takes form that the man and woman, the relationship between them breaks down, and you get possessiveness on the one hand, you get control on the other, and you get a confusion in their relationship, right? And then that disorder is immediately then communicated to the rest of creation, and then it's not made explicit. It seems to me it's not hard to argue the final point, that in fact reverberates through things themselves. I take I think this is the reading here that's implied, and I think it's the heart of John Paul II. So what am I saying? So then we have to elaborate here more about what we mean, but what do we mean by a child? It's an archetype of a gift. That is, the child is an agent through reception, and it's simultaneous. I give as a receiver. I'm active as receptive. I'm all of those, that kind of, that's what a gift is. So I participate in gift giving qua gift. Okay? That's the structure of a child. And there's original solitude, so you can build that out. So a child is the archetype in the natural order of worship. Abba, a relationship to the Father, obedience, and so on and so forth. Then the second thing is the confusion of a man and a woman, who in there, it says, the further text, and you read in, is that they're meant to be two become one flesh, and they're fruitful. And so their body is itself, participates in their symbolic structure, and the body then becomes a symbol of unity that fructifies. Now, we could go on and on about this, but a fundamental point that I want to make that I think is crucial and I think eminently defensible in terms of John Paul II is that it has an intrinsic relation to liberation theology. So the recovery of the symbolic dimension of being, at its core, is a recovery of the human being as a symbol in the form of being a child, being a man, being a woman, being fruitful in children, procreation. The point that I think is crucial here is that to see the reversal here, which is the reversal is problems. Then it's important to ponder what are the hallmarks increasingly of modern societies in terms of the development of modern societies. What is a child? A child is subject to being terminated, aborted. We have ARTs and so forth. The confusion of gender and homosexuality, contraception, divorce, and these things. What's my point? I'm not talking about anything we're not aware of. The point is, these are not, in the first instance, moral problems. They're problems of the theological logic of being. That's the point for John Paul II. They have to do with what it means to image God. So, there's an archetype that plays an archetypal role, and so the problems cannot. When we read these problems, it's not a question in society of a moral aberration. It's a matter of the negative transcendence of God. Okay, for the reasons given. So that is what I want to say about that, and I can be developed. Can I make one final point then? 2 minutes? He's going to give me 2 minutes, which is probably there. Maybe can come out. But what I want to say then, in the context of what I probably should read this to get it. But what I would say, characterizing the recent synod, all of the debate that's been swirling in the air, and the discussion of the synod, there's yet to be an apostolic exhortation. Here is my question that needs to be posed, and it has to do with the sacramental principle and the symbolic meaning of the human being. In other words, what it seems to me is that the difficulty is the terms of the problem are set in a way that simply don't integrate the last 50 years of the papacy. That is, the center of Paul VI, the center of John Paul II, and the center of Ratzinger. The way the debate is framed, regardless of the conclusion. What do I mean by that? The opposition between law and spirit, ideas in person, doctrine in practice, and so on and so forth, to conceive those in the first instance as two things that need to be brought together is to start with a non-symbolic view of being, a non-sacramental view of being. That's my point. And whether it comes out orthodox or not, we could talk about that. The problem is orthodoxy. The orthodoxy will be an orthodoxy that's arrived at on terms that have not yet faced the problem of modernity. So that in a certain sense, they're framing the issue as it went into the Second Vatican Council, but in ways that take elements from what's happened in between, but not integrated. That's exactly what's been going on in the last 50 years, is working out of this symbolic meaning. And the very simple point that I want to make is that it's very dangerous to moralize the meaning of justice and mercy. You can't resolve that problem outside the context of the sacramental principle. That's the simple point. So it's the terms in which the debate is going on. And that's the question I would raise. Those questions have to be opened up. The problem with linking doctrine with Pelagianism, a certain appeal to doctrine, and of course it can happen, is that if that's your first way of approaching doctrine, what you're implying is a subject governed by Pelagian power. That is, no longer is the power of the subject something that is effectively communicated by nature and by sacrament. That is, the question of mercy has to arrive from inside the primacy of God's activity through nature and sacrament in some essential way. Otherwise, it's missing the point. Okay, and there's more things that I could say about that, but how do we respond to that? You know, there are some things that can be said about that are consistent with this logic. How do we respond if the problem is the absence of a symbolic view of being? Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I mean, what that means, but I can't. So, thank you.